What if I told you that the greatest economic boom in history was actually a ticking time bomb? The 1920s promised peace and prosperity, but beneath the champagne and jazz, forces were gathering that would plunge the world into its darkest hour. This is the story of how hope turned to horror. The Paris Peace Conference, beginning in 1919, legally ended the First World War and established a new geopolitical and economic order across the globe. We can briefly call this order the Versailles system, named after the peace treaty signed with Germany. The Versailles system granted guardianship of the global order to the four great victorious powers: Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. Meanwhile, it imposed the enormous economic damage of the Great War upon the defeated Central Powers through war reparations. One of the most important aims of the Versailles system was to ensure that Germany, brought to its knees economically and militarily, would never again pose a threat to Europe and the world. War reparations, strict limitations on the German army and navy, the prohibition of the German-Prussian general staff system, the occupation of the Rhineland, which was Germany's gateway, and Germany's encirclement from the east and south by the newly created Poland and Czechoslovakia all served this purpose. The League of Nations, predecessor to today's United Nations, was the most important institution of the Versailles system. However, the Versailles system began to collapse the moment it was established. The United States, the main financier of the Great War, found itself in a strange situation when Democratic President Wilson failed to get the Versailles Treaty through the Senate. The Senate hesitated to accept the treaty on the grounds that the article requiring member states to support military action against any aggressor nation that attacked a League member was unconstitutional. I must note that the United States of the 1920s was quite different from the post-1945 America. During this period, an approach supporting isolation from global conflicts and disputes dominated American politics. The United States had entered World War I only after Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare sank American ships, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, which promised Mexico the states of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, was leaked to the press. Without the major mistakes of the German Foreign Ministry and the Hindenburg-Ludendorff duo at the head of the German General Staff, who wanted unrestricted submarine warfare, American entry into the war would have been quite unlikely. The United States would sign separate bilateral peace treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary in the summer of 1921, 2 years after Versailles. Legally, the Great War truly ended in the summer of 1921. Italy, among the war's victors, was in tremendous turmoil. Despite suffering enormous losses, Italy had only managed to acquire the South Tyrol Trentino regions and Trieste. Italy's reduction to a figurehead alongside France and Britain enabled the rise of the fascist party founded by Benito Mussolini, a former journalist with a long socialist background. Mussolini's doctrine was based on discourses randomly assembled from various thoughts and works of Plato, Nietzsche, and Pareto. In fact, fascism did not rest on the solid intellectual foundation of political movements like republicanism, liberalism, socialism, communism, or even anarchism. It aimed to transform society's disappointments into anger, then convert that anger into a driving force that would make society an extension of the state within the framework of goals set by the state. The only tangible goal Mussolini promised the masses was spazio vitale, meaning vital living space. This goal was to create modern Italy on territory equivalent to the ancient Roman Republic's province of Italia, namely to annex the Dalmatian coastal region from the newly established Yugoslavia. Although fascism gave Italians the goal of creating Greater Italy, Italians in the 1920s were far from deserving the concept of Greater Italy in terms of military, economic, or social maturity. Indeed, just as the German-Austrian offensive at Caporetto broke the Italian army's back within a week during World War I, a repeat of the same defeat would occur in the winter of 1940-1941, when hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers would surrender to a few dozen British Matilda tanks in what is now Libya. British intelligence valued Mussolini as a journalist during the war and financially assisted ultra-nationalist journalists like Mussolini to keep Italy on the verge of collapse in the war. MI5 support was vital to Mussolini's political beginning. Mussolini would bring the fascist party, which he had organized step by step, to power with his March on Rome with 30,000 supporters on October 27-28, 1922. The weak liberal government in power and King Emmanuel III, nicknamed Little Sword, Saboletta, at 153 centimeters, could not stand against Mussolini. In later years, the Italian king would not hesitate to transfer all political power to Mussolini and would be unable to prevent Italy's entry into World War II. What was happening in Italy was actually the least dramatic part of the tremendous change in the world. The real tragedy was unfolding across the enormous geography that formed the former Russian Empire. In Russia, where the Bolsheviks came to power with the October Revolution of 1917, although the opposing White Russian armies attacked from all sides, these armies had no coordination among them. Those fighting against the Soviets were not only the White Russian armies formed by the Tsarist supporters, anarchists, liberals, social democrats, green armies formed by armed peasants, and the Muslim Turkish Basmachi movement in Central Asia, along with opponents holding different views and goals, had raised flags against the Bolsheviks. Ukrainians, Cossacks, Finns, Baltic nations, Caucasian peoples, Poles and Belarusians trying to break away from the vast Russian Empire were also part of this enormous civil war. Moreover, ironically, the struggle against the Soviets was supported by the Germans during World War I in 1917 to 1918, and after the war's end by the French and British. Stranger still, Czech soldiers belonging to the Austro-Hungarian Empire who had been captured during World War I were freed from captivity when the war ended, formed the Czechoslovak Legion, and began fighting against the communists in Siberia. The British-French coalition landed troops in Crimea, Murmansk, and Archangel, while the Japanese occupied the ports of Russia's Far East. However, the communists largely controlled the country's basic economic resources, population, major cities, transportation facilities, and agricultural and mining areas. The Bolsheviks, through methods known as the Red Terror, managed to keep a significant portion of the population in their grip by instilling fear. Some of the methods of the Soviet secret police, Cheka, and the Red Army would not be much different from the brutality of Nazi Germany, which would occupy part of the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1944. It is estimated that 17 to 20 million people died during the 6-year Red Terror and Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1923, which can be said to be close to the massive destruction and losses the Germans inflicted on the Soviet Union, both military and civilian, during World War II. I must note that Boris Pasternak's masterpiece, Dr. Zhivago, brilliantly depicts this period. When the novel was completed in 1956, its publication was banned in the Soviet Union. In 1957, a copy of the novel was smuggled to Italy, and the novel and its author gained worldwide fame. The novel explicitly describes how the chaos and destruction of the Russian Civil War eliminated millions of people, how human life became worthless, and even indirectly, how enormous hunger led people to cannibalism. But these extraordinary events would remain as a backdrop in the shadow of a great love story. Dr. Yuri Andreevich Zhivago's dilemma between his always loved wife Tanya and the woman he loved with passionate love, Lara, would eclipse the enormous drama of the Russian Civil War like a solar eclipse. Although the Soviets appeared to be the winners of the Russian Civil War, the real winners were the Baltic republics, Finland, and Poland, which gained their independence. The Soviet-Polish War followed a particularly interesting course. The Poles suffered defeat in a military operation targeting Kiev against the Soviets weakened by civil war. But immediately afterward, when Soviet armies under Trotsky and Stalin's command marched on Warsaw, the lack of coordination between them and the duo's mutual hostility caused the Soviets to suffer defeat before Warsaw. This incident is called the Miracle on the Vistula. Young Poland was born on territories seized from German and Russian Poland. The Soviet defeat before Warsaw would further widen the gap between Stalin and Trotsky, who were playing for leadership after Lenin in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Lenin's health condition was gradually worsening due to an assassination attempt he suffered in 1918, and after successive crises, he would pass away in January 1924. Lenin, as the politician who founded the Soviet Union, which would live exactly 70 years and become the world's second superpower after 1945, had been able to convert Karl Marx's theories into a communist doctrine suitable for Russia. However, Lenin's theories would bring more death and poverty to Russia,
which had been declining step by step since the Crimean War of 1853 and suffered enormous losses in World War I. The October Revolution of 1917 and the Russian Civil War had caused enormous damage to the agricultural and industrial production remaining in the country, which had emerged from World War I in ruins. The decline in Russia's industrial productivity between 1913 and 1919 was incredible. Production output had fallen to exactly 1/6 of its pre-war level. Although Russia was still an agricultural economy in the early 1920s, the communists ruthlessly crushed the landowners they saw as representatives of the capital class, the kulaks. These people with experience and expertise in the country's agricultural field either fled, were killed, or sent to concentration camps known as gulags. The result was hunger and poverty across a vast geography. Among the reasons for Russia's backwardness today compared to the West in economic, industrial, and technological terms would be the Soviet Revolution and Russian Civil War. Later, with Stalin's policies, the Soviet Union's industrialization drive would partially succeed by using force and expending human capital. For example, among the most important causes of the demographic distortion still seen in Russia today can be shown the terrible civilian and military losses in World War II. However, the human losses of the 1920 to 1939 period, when extraordinary losses occurred such as the Russian Revolution, Red Terror, and the Great Purges during Stalin's era, exceed the losses of World War II. The geography belonging to the former Russian Empire experienced a rarely seen human tragedy in history. This tragedy can only be compared with China's tragedy between 1840 and 1949. These factors lie behind why China and Russia's central administrations are so powerful today and the extraordinary importance both countries give to internal and external security. The territorial and population losses beginning with World War I and the Russian Civil War are a milestone for Russia. After 1917, Russia had lost Finland, a significant part of today's Poland, and the Baltic countries. This trauma was so great that all Soviet leaders after Lenin, especially Stalin, and much later the president of the Russian Federation, Putin, never forgot this great trauma. At the end of the Russian Civil War, while the Bolsheviks achieved definitive victory, the Soviet Union would fall into a tremendous political struggle. In his will, Lenin explicitly stated that Stalin, the general secretary of the Communist Party, which was a symbolic position at that time, should under no circumstances be brought to an important position within the party. Stalin first formed an alliance with Zinoviev and Kamenev, the party's third and fourth most powerful figures, against Trotsky, the party's most powerful man, in 1923 to 1924. When Trotsky's power in the party was weakened, Stalin would then target Zinoviev and Kamenev with the party's right wing. Although Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Lenin's wife Krupskaya struggled together against Stalin, who had thoroughly seized the party in 1926 to 1927, this coalition could not succeed against Stalin, who dominated the party apparatus. Finally, in 1928, Stalin would become the most powerful man in the Soviet Union politically. Even at this date, Stalin was not yet the sole ruler. Stalin would target the party's right wing in the 1930s, and then the Great Purge would begin, in which he would liquidate all old Bolsheviks. After Stalin dominated the party, the target was the survivors of the great landowner class, the kulaks. Stalin's liquidation of the kulaks and forced collectivization of agriculture would result in a sudden drop in agricultural output in the Soviet Union between 1930 and 1933. The enormous hunger of the Russian Civil War had returned to the Soviet Union. But according to Stalin, all the bourgeois elements within the Soviet Union who would make a counter-revolution against the Bolsheviks had been eliminated. Stalin's paranoid mindset had produced the thesis that the great powers, namely Britain, France, and Japan, could attack the Soviet Union at any moment, and that the country needed to immediately close the large industrialization gap between itself and the West.
Especially after 1928, the Soviet Union began a tremendous mining and heavy industry drive at any cost. However, in this enormous drive, millions of people defined as dissidents would be used as slave labor. The Soviet Gulag concentration camp system was actually an enormous slave labor system. The Moscow Metro or the White Sea-Baltic Canal, admired today, was built by hundreds of thousands of slave workers with simple hand tools. For example, the White Sea-Baltic Canal was exactly 227 kilometers long, 3.5 meters deep, and was dug in 20 months. The death rate among the 125,000 Gulag prisoners employed was around 20%. At least, unlike what the Nazis would do later, the Soviet administration released some of the prisoners and reduced the prison sentences of a significant portion. While these dramatic events were happening inside the Soviet Union, Germany was fighting a tremendous struggle. While civil war continued rapidly in the Soviet Union, total chaos reigned in Germany. 2 days before the war's end, Emperor Wilhelm II abdicated and a republic was declared in Germany. The wave of rebellion started by the Navy in Kiel had engulfed the entire country. On one hand, socialists and communists began organizing workers to create autonomous regions within the country, while many units belonging to the German army began fighting socialists and communists in many cities under the name Freikorps or Free Corps, without following the chain of command. Karl Marx had predicted that the communist revolution would begin with the working class uprising in an industrialized Germany. However, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the founder of Germany, had correctly assessed the power of the working class during his rule and implemented Europe's first social reform. In this way, he was able to cunningly separate the Social Democrats from the socialists and communists. While the Social Democrats became part of the system in Germany, socialists and communists became an opposition and marginal movement. Bismarck had also strongly bound the principalities and kingdoms within the German Empire to the German government system. The system Bismarck established in domestic politics was able to hold Germany together and prevent a workers' revolution in Germany even 40 years after his departure from power. Bismarck's system would remain standing even after Germany's occupation and partition after 1945. The Americans who created today's Germany after 1945 would also prefer to blend this system with their own federal government preferences, taking Bismarck's system as a basis. Germany's problem was not civil war. Germany had financed World War I largely by printing money, unlike the Allies. After all sides of the Great War had planned to impose the enormous damage of the war on the losing side as war reparations. Germany, which lost the war, both experienced the inflation created by the enormous money supply it created and had significantly lost its export markets during the war. At the war's end, the loss of the Upper Silesia and Posen provinces and the transfer of Saarland coal mines to the League of Nations control were additionally devastating economically. The economic program called the Hindenburg Program that Germany implemented during the war, which extraordinarily increased weapons and explosives productivity, wore down Germany's industrial inventory at an extraordinary rate, while the use of raw materials used for fertilizer production as inputs in the war industry caused widespread hunger. After the war, Germany's enormous war reparations would be paid not in paper money, but in gold-indexed hard currency. Germany tried to pay the first installments of this war reparation with raw materials, mainly coal, then gave up and officially declared a moratorium. Upon this, France and Belgium would occupy Germany's largest industrial region, the Ruhr Basin, through the occupied Rhineland. As high inflation in Germany turned into hyperinflation, the German people and workers engaged in passive resistance to the occupiers in the Ruhr, and the German government supported this passive resistance by further increasing the money supply. Although the French and Belgians tried to forcibly seize industrial production in the region by imposing an economic blockade on the entire Ruhr Basin and Rhineland, they were unsuccessful. The result is one of history's greatest hyperinflation examples, the 1922-1923 German hyperinflation case. In 1923, the rapidly depreciating German mark fell from 1/160,000 USD on July 1 to 1/1 million USD on October 1. The depreciation then accelerated further, and by November 20th, 1923, $1 had become exactly 4.2 trillion German marks. Meanwhile, while the central government in Germany had been dealing with socialists and communists for the past 5 years, Berlin was becoming aware of another danger. The Nazis, an insignificant group, would attempt a coup in Munich, but this attempt would be easily suppressed. The Nazi Party had been founded by a locksmith named Anton Drexler. While the party was still a small and marginal structure, its management would be seized in its early years by Adolf Hitler and his friends. The name National Socialist Workers' Party, like its own doctrine, was deceptive. The socialist name was given to the party to attract the masses working to survive in Germany. The party actually claimed that Germany was about to win World War I, but was stabbed in the back by Jews and communists, and stated it would eliminate the Treaty of Versailles. Despite Hitler's hypnotic speeches, party members were known as types who wore ridiculous clothes, played trumpets in the streets, and got drunk on beer and schnapps and started fights. The Munich coup attempt was a ridiculous endeavor, but it would make Hitler and the Nazi Party's name known throughout the country. The party's strengthening would begin after the Great Depression of 1929.
Germany would overcome hyperinflation with the new currency, Rentenmark, created based on assets. The Rentenmark currency unit, worth 1 trillion marks, was essentially based on gold-backed bonds and physical goods. France and Belgium would also leave the Ruhr Basin under pressure from the US and Britain. The Americans had calculated that hyperinflation and the Ruhr occupation would lead to a communist coup in Germany, that the Germans could not pay war reparations, and that the French and British, who could not receive war reparations, would not pay their debts to US banks. The solution would be established practically. The Americans would lend 800 million Reichsmarks of equity-like debt, indexed to gold, to the reorganized German central bank. These marks were not like the trashy paper German marks. Their monetary foundation consisted of American bonds issued on Wall Street. German war reparations payments were being restructured. A lighter payment schedule was set for the first 5 years. The German central bank was becoming completely independent from the central government, and 7 foreign members and 7 German members would be appointed to the monetary board. This is how Germany was returning to the international system with the Dawes Plan, the precursor to the first IMF World Bank rescue plan, and the entire world was entering a rapid growth process. Germany would sign the Locarno Agreement with Belgium, France, and Britain in 1925. German Chancellor Gustav Stresemann, with a clever strategy, recognized Germany's western borders, that is, accepting the loss of Alsace-Lorraine and Eupen-Malmedy regions, bringing to the international arena that Germany's eastern borders were controversial. Thus, recognition of Poland and Czechoslovakia's borders remained suspended. Since the Germans had no power to change their western borders anyway, by accepting this, they made a costless concession and made the borders of Poland and Czechoslovakia controversial in the east. The Allied occupation of the Rhineland would be lifted, but Germans still could not send soldiers to the region, and Germany would join the League of Nations. Locarno is the first agreement where Germany essentially broke the chains of Versailles. Dawes and Locarno would bring a period of peace and rapid growth to the entire world, just like the 1990s. The automotive and civil aviation sectors had begun their rise in the 1920s, dragging the entire world economy along with them. The money supply created by credits opened by American banks had created enormous optimism. Henry Ford's production techniques had increased industrial output incredibly, and American firms became pioneers of the global economy with new production, management, and accounting techniques. As the world experienced the first phase of globalization with Dawes and Locarno, the decline in the need for armament allowed resources to flow into the civilian economy. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990-1991 would create the same effect. The 1920s also brought about the liberation of women in the West. Innovations like the washing machine, refrigerator, and vacuum cleaner changed the lives of women who had gained voting rights much more. Women were increasingly joining the workforce and creating their own economies. Women's skirts were shortening to a degree incomparable to the layers and layers of clothing of the Victorian era. The fashion industry began in this period. Especially in automobile advertisements, the new modern and free woman image was created by frequently showing women both traveling by car and consuming alcohol and cigarettes in social life.
In a decade, white women of the West had jumped to a new life as if skipping 2 generations. New birth control methods also enabled women to have fewer children. The change in radio and cinema arts in the 1920s was incredible. Jazz music and swing had become a new fashion. Hollywood was at the beginning of its classic golden age. Silent cinema was transforming into sound and feature-length films. Capital markets in the entire world and the U.S. had entered an uninterrupted rise. Banks were the main sources of cheap and abundant money. The 1920s began troubled for the Western world and continued with tremendous optimism and enthusiasm. The first event closing the 1920s was the death of German Chancellor Gustav Stresemann from a heart attack at age 51. Stresemann would be remembered as Germany's most important politician after Bismarck and Adenauer. Long before Hitler and in much difficult times, he had broken the chains of Versailles. Hitler would later use Stresemann's legacy in a bad way. A famous and popular historian of ours with a professor title once claimed that Germans could not produce master diplomats. Yet Germany's diplomat chancellors were among the best diplomats of the modern world. Stresemann is at the forefront of these. He was both chancellor and foreign minister at the same time. Our famous historians are profiles distant from the variables of the global economy and the science of geopolitical strategy, close to former Ottoman dynasty members. If Stresemann had lived longer, probably Danzig, the Polish corridor, and Upper Silesia would have been returned through another agreement to be established between France, Britain, and Germany without the need for a world war. The British policy was on a similar line with German demands. The British had been the side bearing the main burden of the Great War and aimed to regain their former power in a globalizing and normalizing world. The British's main problem were the uprisings in Iraq, Palestine, India, and Egypt under the Empire. A hostile Germany was not a preferred situation for the British. France would also come to the same line after World War II, at the stage of losing its colonies. The beginning of the European Union starts not so much from French-German rapprochement, but from the First Vietnam War, which led to the loss of Indochina, namely today's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. About 2 weeks after Stresemann's death on October 24, 1929, Black Tuesday, the New York Stock Exchange would collapse. Dreams would turn to nightmares, and nightmares created monsters. The Great Depression had begun, and the world would step by step head for World War II, just like a ship caught in a maelstrom, relentlessly pulled to the center of the vortex. The Roaring Twenties didn't just end, they exploded, and from their ashes would rise horrors the world had never seen before.